The envelope had already been opened, the name had already been read. The audience at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion was already on its feet, already applauding, already performing the ritual that Hollywood performs every year to remind itself that it is the most important industry in the world, and that the people it decides to honor are the most important people in that industry. Jack Nicholson walked to the stage to collect his first Academy Award for Best Actor in March of 1976, and he did something that no one in that room had quite expected. He grinned. Not the grateful, overwhelmed grin of someone who cannot believe their good fortune. Not the professional smile of someone who had prepared remarks and was about to deliver them with practiced humility. He grinned the way a man grins when he has just been handed something he always knew was going to arrive eventually, and finds the waiting, in retrospect, faintly comic. He took the Oscar. He held it up. He looked at it for a moment the way you look at a piece of furniture that has finally been delivered after a longer than expected delay. Then he looked at the audience, and the grin widened slightly, and he said what he had to say, and he walked off the stage, and the industry he had just been officially inducted into by its most prestigious ritual had no idea that it had just handed a weapon to the one man in Hollywood who had absolutely no intention of using it the way they intended. This is not the story of Jack Nicholson's awards. The awards are just the frame. This is the story of what he did with the power those awards were supposed to represent, and why the answer to that question is the reason the entertainment industry still does not entirely know how to talk about him. To understand it fully, you have to understand what the Oscar's actually for. Not what it claims to be for, which is artistic excellence, the recognition of the finest performances in American cinema in a given year. What it is actually for is considerably more interesting and considerably less flattering to everyone involved. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences was founded in 1927, and one of its earliest and most durable functions was the management of labor relations in the film industry. The studios that created the Academy were the same studios that employed the actors, directors, writers, and technicians who voted in it, and the logic of establishing an institution that rewarded loyalty and penalized disruption was not lost on the people who built it. The Oscar, from its earliest iterations, functioned in part as a system of incentive and control. You behaved the way the industry needed you to behave. You promoted the films the studios needed promoted. You said the things in interviews that kept the machinery running smoothly. And at the end of that process, if you had been sufficiently cooperative and sufficiently talented and sufficiently willing to subordinate your own instincts to the collective needs of the industrial complex you were part of, you might receive the statuette as confirmation that you had played the game correctly. Jack Nicholson understood this system with the clarity of someone who had spent a decade on its margins before being admitted to its center. The B-movie years with Roger Corman, the television bit parts, the slow accumulation of craft in roles that no one was watching and no one was nominating and no one was going to reward with anything other than a paycheck that barely covered the rent, those years had given him something that the actors who arrived at success quickly rarely acquired. They had given him a completely unromantic understanding of what the entertainment industry actually was, which is to say, a business organized around the extraction of profit from human creativity and possessed of exactly as much interest in artistic integrity as was necessary to make the product commercially viable and not one grain more. He had seen it from the bottom. He knew the architecture, and when Easy Rider in 1969 catapulted him from the margins to the center with a speed that surprised everyone, including Jack, he arrived at the top of the system with the perspective of someone who had spent years studying it. From a position where its mechanics were visible in a way they never were to people who had always operated from within its protected interior. The first nomination for Easy Rider, he lost. The second nomination for 5 Easy Pieces the following year, he lost. The third, for The Last Detail in 1974, he lost. The fourth, for Chinatown the same year, he lost. 4 nominations before the first win. 4 opportunities for the Academy to extend the hand of official recognition and then withdraw it. There is a particular psychological effect that this sequence produces in a person of Jack's specific constitution, and it is not the effect of humility or gratitude or increased determination to please the people who hold the power of recognition. The effect is the hardening of a suspicion that was already present into something closer to certainty. The suspicion is this: the people in that room, the ones doing the voting and the applauding and the standing ovations, are not actually responding to what you do. They are responding to what your doing means to them, which is a very different thing. And if what you're doing means to them is occasionally inconvenient, occasionally uncomfortable, occasionally a little too honest about things that an industry built on comfortable fictions would prefer to leave unexamined, then the recognition will come slowly, if at all. And when it does come, it will arrive with strings attached that the statuette itself does not acknowledge, but that everyone in the room understands perfectly. Jack understood them. He just declined to be bound by them. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. In 1975 was not a project that the major studios wanted to make. It had been a novel since 1962. It had been a Broadway play. It had been a film project that passed through multiple hands over more than a decade, each time failing to secure the backing it needed because the people with the money to make it kept arriving at the same conclusion, which was that a film about institutional abuse, about the systematic destruction of nonconformity by the mechanisms of social control, about a charismatic disruptor who gets lobotomized for refusing to be manageable, was not a film that the industry was particularly eager to fund. Kirk Douglas, who had originated the role of McMurphy on Broadway, spent years trying to get it made. He eventually passed the rights to his son, Michael Douglas, who produced the film at the age of 30, with a combination of tenacity and creative financing that the major studios watched from a careful distance. Jack Nicholson took the role of Randall Patrick McMurphy and understood immediately that he was not being asked to play a character. He was being asked to be himself in a context that had been specifically designed to reveal what he had always been. McMurphy is the man who cannot be made to fit, who looks at the rules of the institution he has been placed in and finds them not just arbitrary but actively hostile to the continued existence of anything genuinely alive, who fights not because he has a coherent political philosophy about institutional power, but because the alternative, submission, compliance, the performance of acceptable behavior in exchange for the rewards that acceptable behavior is supposed to generate, is simply not something his body is capable of. Jack played this with his entire nervous system, not his technique, not his craft, not the accumulated skill of 15 years of professional training and experience, all of which were present and deployed, but were not the source of what the camera captured. The source was something older and more personal. The source was the specific understanding of a man who had grown up performing an identity that was built on a secret, who had spent a decade performing competence and patience in an industry that kept telling him he was not quite ready for the recognition he could see other people receiving, who had developed over the course of that decade a relationship with institutional authority that was neither rebellious in the theatrical sense nor compliant in the professional sense, but something more dangerous than either, which was simply indifferent. McMurphy does not hate the institution. 8. He finds it faintly ridiculous. He grins at it. And that grin, Jack's grin, the one that had been developing since childhood and had been deepened by the phone call of 1974 and was now being deployed in the service of a character who embodied everything that the Academy had been rewarding Jack for despite itself, was the thing that won the Oscar. The Academy gave him the statuette in March of 1976, and the industry exhaled slightly, because the narrative of Jack Nicholson as the dangerous outsider who had finally been admitted to the legitimate center was a narrative that served everyone's interests. It allowed the institution to claim him without having to acknowledge that everything interesting about him was precisely his relationship to institutions of the kind it represented. Jack took the statuette and understood this dynamic with complete clarity, and used the understanding the way he used every other piece of information that the world provided him with, which was as material. If the Oscar was a tool of institutional control dressed up as artistic recognition, then the correct response was to accept it with the warmth it deserved as a piece of skilled craftsmanship, and to continue doing exactly what he had been doing before it arrived, which was whatever he wanted. The years between the first Oscar in 1976 and the second in 1984 are the years that define what Jack Nicholson actually was, as distinct from what the industry needed him to be. The Shining in 1980, directed by Stanley Kubrick, was not a film that the Academy rewarded with nominations. It received 0 Academy Award nominations. This is a fact so comprehensively bizarre, so thoroughly inexplicable on purely aesthetic grounds, that it has generated decades of analysis and speculation about what it actually represents. What it actually represents is the industry's discomfort with something it could not categorize. The Shining was not a horror film in the way that genre films were understood. It was not a prestige drama in the way that Oscar bait was constructed. It was something that existed outside the taxonomy that the award system depended on. A film that used the conventions of the genre thriller to deliver something that operated on a register closer to nightmare, to the specific experience of watching someone you recognize become someone you cannot account for. And it starred Jack Nicholson giving a performance that the Academy had no framework for rewarding, because the performance itself had no framework for containing. He had gone somewhere in that film that the institution could not follow and was not sure it wanted to. The 0 nominations were not an oversight. They were a verdict. The verdict was, this is not the Jack Nicholson we gave the Oscar to. This is something else. And something else was exactly right. Terms of Endearment in 1983 brought the second Academy Award, this time for Best Supporting Actor, in a role that required him to be charming and flawed and ultimately human in a way that the institution was entirely comfortable recognizing. Garrett Breedlove, the retired astronaut and aging Lothario who courts Shirley MacLaine's character, was not a role that pushed against the system's edges. It was a role that demonstrated that Jack could operate within the system's preferred register when he chose to, and the industry rewarded this demonstration with the gratitude it reserves for confirmation that its most unpredictable assets have not, after all, slipped entirely beyond its control. Jack accepted the second Oscar with the same grin as the first. The industry continued to believe that the grin was an expression of pleasure. It was not. Or rather, it was, but not the pleasure the industry imagined. It was the pleasure of a man watching a very complicated game proceed exactly as he expected. Batman in 1989 was the moment the transaction became completely explicit. Jack Nicholson negotiated his contract for the role of the Joker with the specific understanding that he would receive, in addition to his salary, a percentage of the film's gross revenue from box office, merchandise, and ancillary markets. This was not a standard arrangement for actors in 1989. Stars received salaries, large salaries, sometimes enormous salaries, but salaries, fixed amounts agreed upon before production began, amounts that did not increase regardless of how successful the film became. The studio bears the risk, the studio reaps the reward, the talent receives compensation for their contribution and returns to being talent. Jack understood that this arrangement served the studio's interests considerably more than it served his own, and he declined it. The negotiation was reportedly extended, and reportedly contentious, and reportedly ended with Jack walking away from the table more than once. He ultimately received a deal that gave him somewhere between $50 and $90 million in total compensation from the film, depending on which account you believe, because the film grossed over $400 million worldwide against a production budget of $35 million, and the percentage arrangements Jack had insisted upon applied across multiple revenue streams that the studio had not fully anticipated would be as lucrative as they became. The studio executives who signed the deal believed they were accommodating a difficult star in order to secure a performance they needed. They were correct that they needed the performance. They were incorrect in their assessment of who was accommodating whom. Jack took his percentage and returned to Mulholland Drive and watched Batman merchandise flood every retail outlet in America, and said nothing publicly about the arrangement except in one interview to note that it had worked out reasonably well. A Few Good Men in 1992 gave him the line that became his most quoted, the 4 words that every impression of Jack Nicholson eventually arrives at, the sentence that has been reprinted on posters and coffee mugs and social media graphics for 30 years. You can't handle the truth. The line is almost always quoted in isolation, stripped of its context in the film, which is the context of a man who has been maneuvered into a courtroom by people who believe they can use the formal mechanisms of the legal system to extract a confession from him, and who responds by delivering not a confession but an accusation, turning the logic of the proceeding entirely around so that the institution that was supposed to be judging him becomes instead the thing being judged. The line resonates not because it is a clever piece of dialogue, though it is that. It resonates because it captures something precise about the specific experience of watching someone refuse to perform the submission that institutional authority demands, and instead performing the inverse, the submission of the institution to someone who has simply decided that the rules it operates by do not apply to him and is prepared to demonstrate this in terms clear enough that the entire room understands it simultaneously. Jack delivered the line with the energy of a man who had been waiting his entire career for a script to hand him the sentence he had always believed but never quite had the formal occasion to state. He received his 4th Academy Award nomination for it. He lost. The industry was not, after all, quite ready to give its most prestigious award to the explicit articulation of its own dispensability. The 3rd and final Oscar came in 1998 for As Good as It Gets, for a performance that the industry found easier to reward than almost anything else Jack had done, precisely because Melvin Udall, the obsessive-compulsive novelist Jack played, is a man who is brought, reluctantly and against his every instinct, back into the structures of human connection and social behavior. He is redeemed in the film's moral framework by learning to participate, by learning to accommodate others, by learning, in other words, to do the thing that Jack Nicholson himself had spent his entire career refusing to do, which is to subordinate his own particular way of being in the world to the preferences of the institutional structures that surrounded him. The Academy gave Jack his 3rd Oscar for playing a man who learns to comply. The irony of this is so complete that it functions almost as a statement of purpose, though whether the purpose was Jack's or the Academy's, or some collaboration between them that neither party fully intended, is a question that does not resolve cleanly. What can be said is that at the ceremony in 1998, Jack Nicholson sat in the front row in his sunglasses, and when his name was called, he stood and walked to the stage and collected the statuette and grinned. And the grin was exactly the same grin as 1976, and exactly the same grin as 1984, and exactly the same grin as every moment in between when the industry had extended its hand of recognition, and Jack had shaken it without for a single moment pretending that the handshake meant what the industry needed it to mean. The sunglasses at the Oscars deserve their own consideration, because they have been discussed for decades as if they were simply an affectation, a piece of personal branding, a signal of effortless cool maintained by someone who understood the value of a consistent visual signature. They are all of these things. They are also, more precisely and more interestingly, the most compact possible statement of Jack Nicholson's relationship to the institution of Hollywood celebrity. The Oscar ceremony is a place where the industry asks its most powerful members to make themselves visible, to sit in the audience and be photographed and interviewed and observed in the specific way that confirms their place in the hierarchy. To be seen being seen. The sunglasses are the refusal of exactly this. They make Jack present while simultaneously making him private. He is there, he is not available. He has shown up to the ceremony that the industry requires him to attend, and he has brought himself, and he has absolutely not brought the particular form of self that the cameras are looking for. The eyes are the thing the cameras want most, because the eyes are where the specific vulnerability of celebrity is most visible, the need for approval, the anxiety about judgment, the gratitude that confirms the power of the people doing the granting. Jack's eyes, behind the sunglasses, are simply absent from the transaction. He has attended. He has not submitted. Nobody ever asked him to remove the glasses. This is worth dwelling on. In a room full of the most powerful people in the entertainment industry, in the presence of studio heads and network executives and the people who controlled the careers of everyone present, nobody ever looked at Jack Nicholson in his sunglasses and said, "The house rules require that you take those off." Because the house rules, when it came to Jack, had always been somewhat provisional. The industry had understood since approximately 1969 that the usual tools of management and incentive and control operated differently on this particular person than on everyone else, and that the attempt to enforce conventional standards would produce results that were considerably more disruptive than whatever was produced by simply allowing the deviation to continue. He had never been managed, he had been accommodated, and there is a very significant difference, though it is one that the accommodators rarely admit to themselves. The films Jack chose not to make are as revealing as the ones he did. After The Shining, after the 0 nominations and the mixed critical reception and the experience of making something that the industry could not categorize, he had a period of relative commercial reliability in the early 1980s that served his financial interests and satisfied the industry's need for a version of Jack Nicholson it could plan around. Terms of Endearment, The Border, Prizzi's Honor, Heartburn. These are not films that push against anything. They are films that demonstrate that Jack Nicholson was capable of operating within the existing parameters when the project interested him enough and the terms were acceptable. The word terms is doing considerable work in that sentence. Jack's terms for taking a role were not the usual calculus of salary plus points plus promotional commitments. His terms included creative input that most stars of the era did not insist upon and most studios of the era did not grant. He read scripts with the eye of a writer, which he was, having written or co-written multiple films during the years before Easy Rider. He had opinions about structure, about character arcs, about the relationship between what a film said and what it showed. He expressed these opinions with the candor of someone who had nothing to lose from honesty, which was accurate because by the mid-1980s, Jack Nicholson had enough money and enough standing that the usual leverage available to studios negotiating with talent simply did not apply to him. You could not threaten his career. You could not imply that other options were available, because other options were always available to both parties and everyone knew it. And the pretense that the studio held power did not actually hold in this particular relationship was the kind of fiction that Jack found not offensive, but simply dull. The Witches of Eastwick in 1987 is a useful case study. He played Darrell Van Horn, the devil, essentially, a figure of absolute hedonistic energy who arrives in a quiet New England town and liberates 3 women from their various forms of repression before the narrative requires him to be repelled. The role was written as a villain. Jack played it as the most alive person in the film. The studio received the performance it had contracted for and released a film in which the ostensible antagonist was more appealing than anyone arrayed against him, which was not precisely what the script had intended, but was precisely what anyone who understood what Jack Nicholson actually did with characters should have anticipated. The producers of Batman 2 years later did anticipate it. They built the Joker around it. The explicit deal was, give him the role and the percentage and the creative latitude, and in exchange, receive a performance that will be the reason people see the film. The deal was honored on both sides. The film made $400 million. Jack made somewhere between $50 and $90 million. The Joker performance became one of the defining cultural images of the late 20th century. The studio walked away satisfied. Jack walked away considerably richer, and with the additional satisfaction of having demonstrated, with mathematical precision, exactly what his participation was worth when properly compensated. The negotiation had not been about ego. It had been about information. Jack understood what his participation in Batman was worth. The studio's initial offer reflected a different understanding. The gap between those two understandings was the negotiation, and the resolution of the negotiation was the resolution of who had accurate information and who did not. By the 1990s, the system had adapted to him in the specific way that systems adapt to forces they cannot eliminate, which is by incorporating them. Jack Nicholson was by then not a disruptive element in the Hollywood machinery. He was a feature of it. The studios had learned to build his particular requirements into their planning. The press had learned to work with the specific version of access he made available, which was enough to fill a story and not enough to reveal anything he had not decided to reveal. The awards apparatus had calibrated itself to his output in a way that rewarded the work it could categorize and ignored the work it could not. The accommodation was mutual and imperfect and entirely characteristic of how the entertainment industry manages anything it cannot control, which is to build a frame around it and call the frame a relationship. Jack understood the frame. He sat inside it when it suited him and stepped outside it when it did not, and the industry responded to these departures the way a sophisticated institution responds to any behavior it cannot prevent, which is to retroactively incorporate them into the narrative of the person's legend. He wore sunglasses at the Oscars. This became part of who he was. He negotiated percentages that other stars did not negotiate. This became part of his image as a player who understood the game. He gave performances that the Academy could not find a category for. These became the performances that critics discovered years later and placed in the canon. The system absorbed everything he threw at it and reconstituted it as myth, because myth is how the entertainment industry neutralizes the things it cannot otherwise contain. The question of what Jack Nicholson actually gave the industry the finger about, as opposed to what the mythology of the gesture suggests, is worth asking precisely because the mythology is so much tidier than the reality. The mythology says, Jack was the rebel who refused to play by Hollywood's rules. The reality is more complicated and more interesting. Jack played by Hollywood's rules extensively and selectively, and with a precision that suggested not rebellion but something closer to mastery. He attended the ceremonies. He made the promotional appearances. He gave the interviews, carefully, controlling what was revealed and what was not with the skill of someone who had been managing his own public image since before most of his interviewers had been born. He made the blockbusters and negotiated the deals and participated in the commercial machinery of the industry with full understanding of how it worked and what his participation in it was worth. What he refused to do, consistently and completely and without exception across 5 decades, was to pretend that any of this was something other than what it was. He would not perform gratitude for recognition that he understood was transactional. He would not perform humility in the face of power that he understood was contingent. He would not perform the relationship between talent and institution as though it were a relationship between equal partners genuinely committed to each other's flourishing, because he understood that it was not that, had never been that, and that the performance of it as though it were served the institution's interests and nobody else's. This refusal to perform the required fiction is what the sunglasses represent. Not contempt for the ceremony. Not indifference to being seen. The specific, deliberate, entirely conscious refusal to provide the eyes that the cameras were looking for, the eyes that would have completed the image of grateful celebrity, anointed by institutional recognition, confirmed in its place by the approving gaze of its peers. Jack showed up. He brought his talent and his history and his 3 Oscars and his 12 nominations and the accumulated weight of 50 years of work that had permanently altered the landscape of American cinema. He sat in the front row. He watched the proceedings with the attention of someone who finds them genuinely interesting rather than genuinely important. And he kept his eyes to himself, because his eyes, and what they had seen, and what they knew, and what they had decided about the institution they were looking at, and the statuettes it dispensed, and the power it claimed, and the fictions it required, those belonged to him. They had always belonged to him. The Oscar belonged to the Academy. The grin belonged to Jack. If this story of the man who took Hollywood's highest honor and used it entirely on his own terms, who understood the system well enough to work it from the inside while remaining permanently, unalterably outside its actual grip, who grinned at the institution that tried to own him for 50 years and was still grinning when he walked away, moved you, then subscribe and share it with someone who has ever sat in a room full of powerful people and understood, without being able to explain it yet, that the power in the room was not where everyone assumed it was. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Ring the notification bell. And remember, the most subversive thing you can do inside any institution is to understand it completely and refuse to pretend otherwise. Jack Nicholson did it for 50 years. In front of everyone. with a grin that the industry spent 50 years trying to interpret and never quite managed to decode.